Sarah used to believe that love, real love, was something solid, something you could build a life on and trust not to crack beneath your feet. When she first met Daniel in college, it didn't feel like the beginning of something fragile. It felt inevitable, like two pieces of a story finally finding each other. He was standing under a flickering hallway light outside a lecture room, laughing at something she didn't hear. But when his eyes met hers, the rest of the world seemed to quiet in a way that felt both strange and comforting. Their connection unfolded quickly after that. Late-night conversations that stretched into morning, shared coffee cups gone cold on library tables, the kind of laughter that left her breathless and certain she had found her person. By the time they graduated, Sarah couldn't remember who she had been before him, and she wasn't sure she wanted to. Their wedding day felt like stepping into a dream she had rehearsed 1,000 times in her mind. Her hands trembling slightly as she adjusted her dress, Daniel's voice catching just enough during his vows to make her heart swell with a fierce, protective love. When he promised forever, she believed him completely, because at that moment there was nothing in his eyes that suggested anything less than truth. The early years of their marriage were painted in warm, golden hues. Small apartments filled with mismatched furniture and big dreams, quiet evenings spent cooking together, the comfort of falling asleep tangled in each other's arms. When Lily was born, everything shifted in a way that was both overwhelming and beautiful. Sarah remembered the exhaustion most of all, the bone-deep fatigue that made the world feel hazy, but also the way Daniel had looked at their daughter the first time he held her, tears slipping down his face as if he couldn't quite contain the magnitude of what they had created. He had stayed up with Sarah during those endless nights of feeding and crying, whispering reassurances when she felt like she was failing, pressing soft kisses to her temple when she was too tired to speak. It was in those moments, in the quiet hours when the rest of the world slept, that Sarah felt safest, most certain that she was exactly where she was meant to be. When Noah arrived a few years later, their lives became even fuller, louder, messier, filled with the chaos of toys scattered across floors, laughter echoing through the house, with weekend hikes where Daniel would carry one child on his shoulders while holding the other's hand, and slow evenings on the porch where Sarah would lean against him and think, "This is it. This is everything." But even in those golden years, there were small things, barely noticeable at first, that began to shift. Daniel started working longer hours, coming home with a distracted air that Sarah couldn't quite place. Conversations that used to flow effortlessly became punctuated with pauses, with moments where he seemed somewhere else entirely. She told herself it was normal, that life was simply changing as it always does, but there was a quiet unease that settled in her chest, something she couldn't name but couldn't ignore either. She found herself watching him more closely, searching his face for the man she knew so well, reassuring herself that nothing had really changed. And yet, in the stillness of night, when she lay awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, a thought would creep in uninvited. What if I'm not enough? It was a question she never voiced, not even to herself in daylight, but it lingered in the shadows of her mind, growing quietly, feeding on every missed glance and half-finished conversation. As the months passed, that unease began to take shape in more tangible ways. There were moments, small, almost insignificant on their own, that began to add up into something Sarah could no longer dismiss. A faint, unfamiliar scent clinging to his clothes, sweet and foreign in a way that made her stomach tighten. The way his phone would light up during dinner, and his eyes flickering down to it with a smile he didn't seem to realize he was giving. The quick, casual explanations that never quite answered her unspoken questions. Sarah tried to push it all away, to convince herself that she was imagining things, that she was letting her fears get the better of her. But the doubt had already taken root, and it grew stronger with each passing day. She found herself lying awake at night, replaying conversations, analyzing every word, every glance, every silence. In the shower, where the sound of running water masked her quiet sobs, she let herself feel the full weight of her fear, the possibility that the life she had built, the love she had trusted so completely, might not be as unbreakable as she had believed. The night everything finally shattered began like any other. Deceptively ordinary in a way that would later feel cruel. There was nothing to warn her, no sign that this was the moment her world would collapse. And yet, when the truth revealed itself, sudden, undeniable, it felt as though the ground had been pulled out from beneath her. The details blurred together in a haze of shock and pain, but she remembered the physical sensations with startling clarity. The nausea that rose so quickly she thought she might be sick, the trembling in her hands that made it hard to hold on to anything, the way her heart seemed to race and stall all at once. Memories that had once been safe, cherished, became tainted in an instant, each one twisting into something sharp and unbearable. When she confronted Daniel, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and disbelief, the look on his face told her everything before he even spoke. His words came haltingly, wrapped in apologies and explanations that felt both desperate and insufficient. He cried, and for a moment that almost made it worse, the realization that even his remorse couldn't undo what had been done. That first night, after everything came to light, Sarah couldn't bring herself to sleep in their bed. Instead, she curled up beside Lily, holding her daughter close as if she were an anchor in a storm that threatened to pull her under. She listened to the soft, steady rhythm of her child's breathing and tried to focus on that, to ground herself in something that still felt real. But her mind refused to quiet, spiraling through a relentless cycle of denial, anger, heartbreak, and fear. In the days and weeks that followed, their life became something unrecognizable, a fragile, uncertain existence suspended between what had been and what might still be salvaged. Daniel tried, in ways both big and small, to show her that he was committed to fixing what he had broken. There were flowers, quiet gestures of care, moments where he held her as if he were afraid to let go. They went to counseling, sitting side by side as a stranger helped them unpack the tangled mess of their emotions. Sometimes Sarah felt a flicker of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, they could find their way back to each other. But just as quickly, that hope would be overshadowed by doubt, by the persistent question of whether anything he said or did could truly be trusted again. Time passed in this uncertain rhythm, each day blending into the next, until one afternoon, driven by a restless need she couldn't quite explain, Sarah found herself searching through the garage. She told herself she was looking for something practical, something ordinary, but deep down she knew there was more to it, a quiet, insistent pull towards something hidden. When she found the letter tucked away in a place it didn't belong, her heart began to race with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Reading it felt like stepping into another layer of truth, one that was even more complicated, more painful than she had expected. The words blurred as tears filled her eyes, but she forced herself to keep going, to absorb every line, every confession. By the time she finished, she was shaking, her breath coming in uneven gasps as the full weight of what she had discovered settled over her. And yet, despite the pain, there was something else there too, a fragile, desperate hope that maybe this was the piece that would finally make everything make sense, that would allow her to forgive, to move forward. But life, as Sarah would come to understand, rarely offers such clean resolutions. When Daniel disappeared that night, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions, the fragile sense of control she had been clinging to shattered completely. The hours that followed stretched into an endless nightmare, frantic phone calls, desperate drives through dark, empty streets, the constant gnawing fear that something irreversible had happened. By the time the police arrived with their solemn expressions and carefully chosen words, Sarah already knew, in some deep, instinctive way, what they were going to say. The grief that followed was unlike anything she had ever experienced. A complicated, tangled mass of love and anger and loss that refused to settle into anything simple or understandable. At the funeral, surrounded by people who spoke of Daniel with reverence and sympathy, Sarah felt the weight of everything that had been left unsaid, everything that would now remain unresolved forever. In the months that followed, she moved through life in a haze, focusing on her children, on the small, everyday tasks that gave her something to hold on to. She read the letter again and again, searching for answers that never quite came, trying to piece together a version of the truth she could live with. Therapy helped in its own slow, uneven way, giving her the tools to navigate the conflicting emotions that refused to fade. And then, a year later, when she found the second envelope, she realized that the story she had been telling herself, the one she had finally begun to accept, was not the whole truth after all. The words inside that envelope shattered whatever fragile understanding she had built, leaving her once again standing at the edge of something vast and unknowable. Years later, Sarah would look back on everything that had happened and struggle to make sense of it all. She would think about the life she had built, the love she had believed in, the ways it had broken and reshaped her. She would think about Daniel not as a single fixed version of who he had been, but as a collection of contradictions. The man who had held their newborn daughter with tears in his eyes, the man who had betrayed her, the man she had both loved and lost. And in the quiet moments, when the house was still and her children were asleep, she would sit with those contradictions, with the pieces of a story that no longer fit neatly together, and she would remind herself of the one thing she knew for certain, that even in the aftermath of everything, she had survived, and somehow she was still moving forward. A bit more longer story required, Sarah had always believed that love, the kind that people write poems about and build entire lives around, was something steady, something that, once found, would anchor you through anything. When she met Daniel during her second year of college, it didn't feel like chance. It felt like recognition. He was leaning against a chipped wall outside a crowded lecture hall, sunlight filtering through dusty windows and catching in his hair. And when he looked at her, it felt as though something inside her had been quietly waiting for that exact moment. Their first conversation was awkward in the way all meaningful beginnings are. Half-finished sentences, shared laughter that came too easily, a sense of familiarity that neither of them could explain. Within weeks they were inseparable. They studied together, though more time was spent talking than reading, and took long walks across campus where the world seemed to shrink to just the two of them. Sarah found herself telling him things she had never said out loud before, her fears, her dreams, the quiet insecurities she carried about not being enough, not being memorable, not being the kind of person someone would choose forever. Daniel always listened with a softness that made her feel seen, his reassurances wrapping around her like something warm and protective. By the time graduation came, there was no question of what came next. Their lives had already intertwined in ways that felt impossible to separate. Their wedding day was a blur of emotion, anticipation, and quiet moments that felt almost sacred. Sarah remembered standing in front of the mirror, her hands trembling as she adjusted the delicate lace of her dress, her heart pounding with a mixture of joy and fear. Forever was a big promise, one that carried a weight she could feel pressing gently against her chest. But when she saw Daniel waiting for her at the end of the aisle, his expression open and full of something that looked so much like love it almost hurt to see, all her doubts seemed to fade into the background. His vows were simple, and spoken in a voice that wavered just enough to make them real. And when he promised to choose her every day, she believed him with a certainty that felt unshakable. Their early years of marriage were filled with the kind of happiness that doesn't draw attention to itself because it feels so natural. They built a home out of small things, shared meals, inside jokes, quiet evenings spent side by side doing nothing in particular. There was a rhythm to their life that felt safe, predictable in the best possible way. When Lily was born, that rhythm shifted, but not in a way that broke it. Rather, it expanded, making room for something even deeper. The night she came into the world was long and exhausting, filled with moments where Sarah thought she couldn't possibly keep going, only to find that she somehow did. And she would never forget the way Daniel had held her hand through it all, his grip steady even when her own strength faltered, or the way his face crumpled with emotion when he first held their daughter. Tears streamed down his cheeks as he whispered something Sarah couldn't quite hear, his voice breaking under the weight of it. In the weeks that followed, their lives became a blur of sleepless nights and constant adjustments. But there was also a quiet beauty in those moments. Daniel would wake up with her in the middle of the night, sitting beside her as she fed Lily, sometimes resting his head gently against her shoulder in silent solidarity. When exhaustion made her doubt herself, made her feel like she was failing in ways she couldn't articulate, he would press a kiss to her temple and tell her she was doing better than she thought. Well, those were the moments Sarah held on to most tightly, the ones that made her feel safe in a way she had never experienced before. Years passed, and with Noah's arrival, their home became even fuller, louder, more chaotic in a way that felt alive. There were toys scattered across every room, laughter that echoed down hallways, and the constant hum of a life that was always in motion. Weekends were spent outdoors whenever possible, hiking trails where Daniel would carry one child on his shoulders while holding the other's hand, pointing out small wonders along the way as if he were determined to make the world feel magical for them. Evenings were slower, softer, often spent on the porch where Sarah would lean into him, listening to the quiet sounds of the night and feeling a sense of contentment that was almost overwhelming. And in those moments, she would think to herself that this ordinary, beautiful life was everything she had ever wanted. But life, as she would come to learn, rarely stays untouched by change. The first signs were so subtle that they were easy to dismiss. Daniel started working longer hours, coming home later than usual, with a distracted look that he brushed off as stress. Conversations that once flowed effortlessly began to falter, interrupted by moments where his attention seemed to drift elsewhere. Sarah told herself it was normal, that this was what happened when life became busier, when responsibilities grew heavier. Still, there was a quiet unease that began to settle inside her. Something she couldn't quite name, but couldn't ignore either. It showed up in small ways, in the way she found herself watching him more closely, searching for reassurance in his expressions, or in the way silence between them sometimes felt heavier than it used to. As time went on, those small shifts began to form a pattern that was harder to overlook. There were moments that lingered in her mind longer than they should have, a faint, unfamiliar scent on his clothes that didn't belong to her, the way his phone would light up and draw his attention with a subtle urgency, the brief smiles he didn't seem to realize he was giving. When she asked questions, his answers came easily, too easily, as though they had been prepared in advance. Sarah wanted to believe him, needed to believe him, but doubt had already taken root. It grew quietly at first, feeding on her insecurities, and on the old fear that she had never fully outgrown, that she might not be enough to hold on to something as precious as the life they had built. Nights became the hardest. Lying awake beside him, listening to the steady rhythm of his breathing, Sarah found her thoughts spiraling in ways she couldn't control. She replayed conversations, analyzed details, searched for meaning in things that might have been insignificant. In the shower, where the sound of running water masked her quiet sobs, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of her fear. She would stand there, arms wrapped around herself, trying to piece together a version of reality that made sense, that didn't threaten to unravel everything she loved. There were moments when she almost confronted him, when the words rose to the surface, trembling on the edge of being spoken. But each time something held her back. The thought of their children, the fear of what the truth might be, the desperate hope that she was wrong. When the truth finally revealed itself, it did so without warning, shattering the fragile illusion she had been clinging to. The moment stretched out in her memory, every second etched with painful clarity, the way her stomach dropped, the sudden rush of heat followed by a cold, hollow numbness, the feeling of her world tilting off its axis. Confronting Daniel was both inevitable and unbearable. His reaction told her everything before he even spoke. The hesitation, the guilt that flickered across his face, the way his voice faltered under the weight of what he had done. His apologies came quickly, tangled with explanations that felt both urgent and insufficient. He cried, and then part of her wanted to comfort him out of habit, out of the love that hadn't simply disappeared. But another part of her recoiled, overwhelmed by a pain so deep it felt almost physical. That night, unable to bear the thought of sharing a bed with him, Sarah went to Lily's room and lay beside her, pulling her daughter close, as if she could shield her from a world that suddenly felt unsafe. She listened to the soft rhythm of her breathing, focusing on it as a way to keep herself grounded. But her mind refused to rest, racing through a storm of emotions, denial, anger, heartbreak, fear, all colliding in a way that left her exhausted and unable to find peace. In the days that followed, life became something unfamiliar, a delicate balancing act between maintaining normalcy for the children and navigating the wreckage of what had been broken. Daniel tried in ways both small and significant to show her that he wanted to fix things. There were flowers, quiet gestures, moments where he held her, as if afraid she might disappear. They went to counseling, sitting together in a room that felt both safe and suffocating, unpacking their pain under the guidance of someone who saw them as a problem to be solved. For a while, Sarah allowed herself to hope. There were moments when it felt like they might find their way back, when Daniel's efforts seemed genuine and her love for him felt strong enough to bridge the gap between what had been and what might still be. But doubt lingered, stubborn and persistent, casting shadows over even their brightest moments. Trust, once broken, proved difficult to rebuild, and Sarah found herself caught in a cycle of wanting to believe and being afraid to do so. The discovery of the letter in the garage came at a time when her emotional reserves were already worn thin. She hadn't gone looking for it, not consciously, but when she found it hidden among things that didn't matter, something inside her knew it did. Reading it was like opening a door she hadn't realized was there, stepping into a truth that felt deeper, more complicated than anything she had faced before. Her hands trembled as she turned each page, her breath catching on words that seemed to carry more weight than she was prepared to bear. By the time she finished, tears blurred her vision, and her heart ached with a mixture of pain and something dangerously close to hope. But hope, and she would learn, can be as fragile as it is powerful. When Daniel disappeared that night, leaving behind only silence and unanswered questions, the fragile sense of stability she had begun to rebuild collapsed once again. The hours that followed were filled with fear, desperation, and a growing sense of dread that settled deep in her bones. By the time the news came, delivered in careful, measured words, Sarah felt as though she had already begun to understand what had happened, even if she couldn't bring herself to fully accept it. In the years that followed, she would carry all of it with her: the love, the betrayal, the loss, the unanswered questions that refused to fade. She would raise her children with a strength she hadn't known she possessed, building a life that, while different from the one she had imagined, it was still filled with moments of quiet beauty. And in the stillness of night, when memories surfaced unbidden, she would remind herself that even in the face of everything she had lost, she was still here, still moving forward, still finding a way to piece together a life from the fragments that remained.